Okay, welcome to the Capital Forum interview series. My name is Joe Tipograph, and we're delighted to have Anant Raut here today. As background, Anant has worn many hats in the antitrust community. Previously, he served as antitrust counsel to the House Judiciary Committee and as an attorney at the FTC. He currently sits on the board of the American Antitrust Institute. Anant, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'd love for you to walk me through the legislative process, especially as it relates to antitrust.
Sure.
I know we've seen a lot of action with the Mccarran-Ferguson Act, which is the antitrust immunity to insurance companies. Many times there have been bills that have sought to repeal that act. Walk me through the experiences and just tell me about how it's been going on.
Repealer bills, as well as the Mccarran-Ferguson Act, are a great example of how bills can change in the process of legislation. The Mccarran-Ferguson Act was introduced following a Supreme Court decision in the 1940s, which basically made insurance companies subject to the antitrust laws. For decades, they had assumed, and through lower court legislation, felt like they were not subject to the antitrust laws. Once the Supreme Court said that they were, they then lobbied Congress for basically an extension of time to get their business practices in order in the face of this new legal regime. And of course, a lot of them were asking for an exemption. So when the Mccarran-Ferguson Act was first passed, it was initially passed with a phase-in period for antitrust laws to take effect. However, different versions were passed in the House and the Senate. And when it went into conference, I think it was maybe a 5-year phase-in period, ended up being a permanent exemption for the business of insurance from the antitrust laws. So the interesting thing about the laws in this country, which is both their strength and their weakness, is that they're hard to change once they're in effect. So we've seen versions of a McCarran repealer, something that would have, in effect, removed the antitrust exemption for the insurance industry. We've seen versions introduced in the House or Senate for many years, obviously none of which have been passed. When the Affordable Care Act was being passed, we wrote a McCarran repealer that essentially would have removed the antitrust exemption for the health insurance industry. That repealer was a section of the version of the health care bill that the House passed. When the House passed the health care bill, it went to the Senate. The Senate ended up passing its own version of the Health Care Act, which didn't include the McCarran bill. And by that point, for political reasons, the House had no choice really but to accept the Senate's version. We passed the McCarran repealer as a standalone bill, and it passed something like 400 plus votes to the difference. But it never got picked up in the Senate.
Let me jump in and ask you a couple questions, because you bring up a lot of really interesting points. And I know that people are very interested in this bill. Who have been the key players in the debate?
So one of the main proponents has been John Conyers of Michigan. I think that every session he has introduced a bill. Part of his reason, part of his drive for healthcare reform, for single-payer insurance, for the Affordable Care Act, for repealing healthcare legislation was that as a young civil rights activist in Detroit, he actually watched his brother die in the emergency room, and so has always felt that our healthcare system in this country needs fixing.
So people who are interested in what's going to be happening with Mccarran-Ferguson, what are the key things to watch to see if any of these bills will actually end up getting passed through both houses?
Bipartisanship. I think that the way the Congress is right now, the key for any legislation is to get support from both sides. What's interesting this term is that we've seen McCarran repealers introduced by Democrats. We've seen other McCarran repealers introduced by Republicans. The versions differ in that some of the Republican versions have, for example, caps on class action suits and damages. So if both sides can agree on some sort of middle ground, that is key to getting any sort of legislation passed.
How do antitrust and politics play out over party lines?
Antitrust is one of the less divisive fields of law on Capitol Hill. That is both a positive and a negative. I think that realize that a number of members of Congress, senators, congressmen, and their staff are not lawyers. And so antitrust doesn't necessarily have the same gut reaction, the same instinctive political affiliation as constitutional issues or other issues that people just are more familiar with on a day-to-day basis. The way that plays out is that oftentimes antitrust issues don't get the same spotlight as constitutional issues, and other times they don't fall along the same party lines.
Has antitrust fallen out of opinion at Congress because it's been so developed through case law?
I think that there was a time when, certainly during the Teddy Roosevelt era and the earlier part of the 20th century, when antitrust was a major political issue. You had antitrust as a centerpiece of presidential campaigns. I think now it is seen as a necessary enforcement mechanism on the market, but more direct regulation. For example, in banking, even though antitrust plays a role, I think that the finance industry and the financial regulators, the regulatory bodies are seen as having the more direct role. So antitrust is almost a backstop to a lot of industries, but not something that is necessarily foremost in the minds of members of Congress.
But there is some politics to it. I mean, at the FTC, you see that there's certain rules about who can be nominated. Only 3 commissioners can come from the same party.
Certainly, and the FTC was created by Congress. Realized that when the Sherman Act was created, it was intended to be enforced by the Department of Justice. In the decade that followed, Congress was a little concerned that this enforcement of this new set of law was going to be by an executive agency. And so they wanted in part, they wanted to have a dedicated series of experts to focus and develop antitrust law. The pragmatists might say they also wanted to influence antitrust enforcement a little bit more directly. And with the FTC, Congress has more direct oversight. And with the DOJ, Congress can only change the purse strings, so to speak. With the FTC, for example, is that when you have an open slot on the commission, that slot is not going to get filled unless the minority part, or unless the other party also has someone that they want to get nominated, confirmed for another position somewhere else. So the way the politics plays out is that if you have an open commissioner slot in the FTC, then that may not get filled unless you have an open slot in some other agency, so that the Republicans and Democrats can each get someone confirmed in pairs.
Well, that's really important right now at the FTC because we do have an open slot. What is it going to take for that one to ultimately be filled?
So the open slot that we have right now is a Democrat slot. And for that to be filled, obviously the White House has to go through its vetting mechanisms. But even when they have a candidate, it's unlikely that that person is going to get confirmed into that position unless the Republicans are able to get a Republican confirmed for some other open position in some other part of the government.
Is there anything out there that the Republicans are going to want to see filled anytime soon?
I don't know that there are any hot button or particularly prominent positions, especially because the Republicans are in the minority at the moment. However, there are other Republican slots in other agencies, so maybe a little bit more out of the spotlight and not top of the mind, but in other agencies and other parts of the government where there needs to be a member from the minority party.
We see decisions that are being made at the FTC that get split among partisan lines, where you have, say, 3 Democrats or 2 Republicans or the other way around. What are the key areas of antitrust thought that distinguish Democrats from Republicans?
I think that where you see the party division has to do with philosophy of government. I think that, at least in this current iteration of the 2 parties, Democrats are more likely to support a broader government intervention using the FTC as a more powerful enforcement body. Republicans currently are champions of small government, less government intervention, allowing the market to correct itself more. So I think that comes to a head with the use of the Section 5 of the FTC Act, which I believe a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans are concerned that it may be used too broadly.
The FTC Act, the Democrats believe that the FTC Act is something that should be construed more broadly to reach conduct that otherwise doesn't get captured by the antitrust laws. Is that correct?
I think that's right. And I think if you look at Section 5 of the FTC Act and the way that the FTC Act was passed, if Congress had wanted the FTC to have the exact same enforcement ability as the DOJ, they wouldn't have had to. They could have made the laws exactly parallel. They could have given the FTC joint enforcement over the Sherman Act. They didn't. They gave them a specific set of laws that are different from the other existing antitrust laws. I think the fact that FTC 5 can be so broadly construed is why you've seen people like Commissioner Rush express concern about the potential consequences of not having limitations on how something like the FTC 5 can be used.
Great. All right, Anant, we talked about the process, we've talked about the politics, but I want to know, what role does Congress play in antitrust today, particularly in the world of mergers?
Well, really, Congress does two things that no other body of government can do, and that is introduce, write, and pass legislation and oversight. And I think that when Congress is limiting itself to those areas of antitrust, it does an amazingly effective job. I think there's a tendency to get caught in so-called merger of the week hearings, where a sexy merger comes along and members of Congress want to weigh in on it. I think that sometimes I question the effectiveness of those hearings and what value they ultimately bring. Certainly the DOJ and the FTC, which are charged with deciding whether or not to block the mergers, have amazingly competent staff attorneys and economists who ultimately make the decision and have access to far more documents, conversations with competitor suppliers that members of Congress can possibly have in a 1.5 or 2 hour hearing.
Have you ever seen any examples of Congress actually making a significant impact in a merger decision?
You know, I think that if you asked people at the DOJ and FTC, they would say no. I think that if you asked the merging parties, they would say yes. I point to AT&T T-Mobile as an example of one where the FCC, which really had primary jurisdiction over that merger, was kind of dragging its feet as to whether or not to block the merger. I think that Senator Al Franken did an amazing job on the Senate side of raising concerns, beating the drum about what the merger of these two companies would do for wireless rates for the average consumer. I think the DOJ arrived at its decision to oppose the merger independently, but I think the heat from Congress on top of the DOJ's decision made the merger progressively less palatable for both the merging parties and their shareholders.
We've seen a lot of activity in Congress relating to the pending merger between U.S. Airways and American Airlines. Historically, how have these congressional hearings impacted DOJ's review of airline mergers?
What you'll see in these hearings varies depending upon the parties in charge of the. What you'll see in these hearings, I think, varies. Oftentimes, a member of Congress's interest in a merger it depends entirely upon the district they represent, not necessarily the party they're affiliated with. So with an airline merger, there are some members of Congress that think it's great because it will save two homegrown companies. There are other members of Congress that think this is terrible because once these two companies merge, a hub that's in their district becomes superfluous. So oftentimes, as follow-up from these hearings, members of Congress realize that they can't actually physically do anything to oppose the merger. But in order to show their constituents that they are acting on their behalf, they'll write a letter to the FTC or the DOJ, in the airline's case, the DOJ. And they'll say, and they'll have to carefully couch it so it's not undue influence, but they'll say, we hope that you take into consideration the following factors. And speaking from experience at the FTC, I know that the agencies get these letters on a regular basis, and you have to be sensitive to the needs of members of Congress. But ultimately, that's not what decides whether the agency is going to block a merger.
Now, there's an interesting thing going on in this particular merger between U.S. Airways and American Airlines. The parties are anticipating that the merger might require some divestiture of slots at DCA Airport. In response to this anticipated request from the Department of Justice, the parties are discussing how the slots that they use at DCA tend to serve smaller or mid-sized communities, and they raised these points at the hearing at the Senate. What they said is that if these slots are divested, that the airlines that take the slots will use the same slots that were serving mid-sized communities to serve larger communities. What impact do you see this having with the Department of Justice on whether it requires a divestiture or not?
I think that the Department of Justice has done airline mergers before. I think they are fairly confident in their methodology for their economic analyses. I know that they're going to look at the city pairs. I don't know how much weight they're going to give a pure public interest standard here that they haven't given anywhere else. I think that certainly that will be taken into account, but ultimately it's going to come down to the same economic antitrust analysis, which is, is this going to raise prices? Is this going to reduce output? And if so, will they need to put in measures that are going to keep other airlines, other maverick competitors in the game?
Okay. Now, stepping back, which players right now in Congress do you see as being particularly instrumental over the next couple years?
So the House side, which is controlled by Republicans, the chairman of the full committee is Bob Goodlatte, and of Virginia. The subcommittee chairman is Spencer Backus of, I believe, Alabama. Right now, they've been fairly quiet. Congressman Backus hasn't really had much of a track record in antitrust specifically. Chairman Goodlatte was on the committee when I was there, and he is just really bipartisan. He is down the middle. He's very fair, very balanced. I don't see him as playing party politics with antitrust. I mean, he was as interested in the potentially negative effects of Trinco as he was in opposing antitrust bills that he thought were bad for his district. I think on the Senate side, we might see a little bit more movement. I know Senator Klobuchar has been talked up for her 2016 potential as a vice presidential running mate. I think that she's a great jurist. She has a great legal background. She has introduced legislation that's going to help her home state of Minnesota, but at the same time, she's never been a particularly partisan person. And I think the ranking member on the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee, Mike Lee, worked well with the previous subcommittee chairman, Senator Herb Kohl. He's been working well with Senator Klobuchar. I think what we can expect from them are a lot of bipartisan hearings, a lot of bipartisan legislation. And I think that if you're looking for legislation that has the best chance of passing, watch what the Senate does, because they're more likely to introduce bipartisan legislation that has a good chance of passing. Okay.
And that's interesting, because that's different than what we're hearing about Congress in other areas of the law. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, I said it has the best chance. I'm not saying that anything that comes out of the Senate is necessarily going to pass the House and pass into law. The last piece of, I think, standalone antitrust legislation that passed into law, I think, was in 1998, the Ocean Shipping Bill. Everything else since then has been an extension of existing law, everything since then has been an extension of existing law. So I'm crossing my fingers, but I wouldn't expect to see whole lot of new antitrust law this Congress.
And what industries do you see being of interest to Congress with antitrust?
Well, the legislation to repeal the antitrust exemption for railroads has been of interest before. We've seen it introduced again. There's actually a surprising number of McCarran repealers out this year on the House side, both from Republicans and Democrats. So it'll be interesting to see if they can reach a bipartisan compromise and pass something that both parties will support. I think where we might expect to see some more action in the next year, it would be related to the Affordable Care Act. I don't know how it'll play out, but I would, if I had to guess, you might see healthcare insurers or other parties that are affected by these new exchanges that go into effect come to Congress and ask for some sort of relief from the antitrust laws as they try to grapple with their new mandate under the ACA.
Well, thank you, Anant. That is all the time we have. Thank you for joining us with the Capitol Forum interview series. I'm Joe Tipograph, and let's thank Anant Raut for joining us.
Thank you for having me.